Hi, I'm Sean Stone. Joining me today will be a Grand Master of the Knights Templar. Stick around. This is Buzzsaw. To those of you unfamiliar with the Knights Templar and the meaning of this mysterious secretive order said to have been disbanded back in the 1300s, you'll enjoy this video. We have Timothy Hogan joining us. He is Grand Master within the lodge known as the Ordre Souverain du Temple Initiatique, which is OSTI, one of the oldest Knight Templar lineages. So joining me now is Timothy to explain more of what that actually means and how an order like the Knights Templar, which are said to have come to an end in the 14th century when the Catholic Church disbanded the order, how the Knights Templar still exist and where this lineage comes from. So let's start with that, basically. The OSTI, the Ordre Souverain du Temple Initiatique, what is that lineage, and where does this come from, basically?
Yeah, so back in 1307, the Knights Templar were suppressed by the Roman Catholic Church at the time, and in particular at the behest of King Philip the Fair of France. And by there was a period of 7 years where many Templars were rounded up and tortured, and then in 1314 the order was officially disbanded by the church completely. And at that point it was said that the order ceased to exist, but really what happened was the order just went underground, and it continued to exist in various forms for centuries, making itself known at various times throughout history. In the late 1700s, there was a Grand Master of the order known as Bernard Raymond Palaprat, who was in charge of kind of bringing the order a little bit more public for a little while. And at that time, the order just changed its name to the Order of the Temple. And it continued to exist in this capacity more or less till about 1956, where it was decided it was time for a little bit more public Templar activity. And since that time, the order's been very involved in a number of things. In about 1980, I think it was, maybe 1988, there was so much interest in Templarism that there were all these new orders that were starting to form that were calling themselves Templar. But they were just really fraternal bodies, and they weren't really passing on some of the mysteries of the Templar tradition. And at that time, the Order of the Temple changed its name to the Ordre Souverain du Temple Initiatique, which just means the Sovereign Order of Templar Initiates, and that's how we've been operating since.
But now, also the Templar Knight is a rank, I think, within Freemasonry, no? Within the York Lodge, is it?
That's true, yeah. Within Freemasonry, both within the York Rite of Freemasonry, there's a Masonic Knight Templar tradition, and within the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, in the higher degrees, there are also Knight Templar degrees as well. So both within the United States, in particular, both the Scottish Rite and York Rite have this distinction. And in Europe, there's also a form of Freemasonry called the Swedish Rite of Freemasonry, which is also Templar based.
And does that mean that the Masons, the original Templars were themselves Freemasons, or did the Freemasons later absorb the Templar Knights into its structure?
Yeah, so it's a good question. If you're looking for documentary evidence on this, it's going to be very hard to find. But what we do know is that the Templars back in the 1100s and 1200s were instrumental for providing the funding and a lot of the workforce that was involved in building the cathedrals. In France in particular, places like Chartres and Notre Dame and other places. And what happened was, when the order was suppressed, at least according to our records, some of these Templars who were also Masons within the Templar order fled to places like Scotland, and at that time they, in order to remain hidden and underground, they just took on the outer facade of being stonemasons in order to perpetuate the tradition there.
So
in other places, like in France, they just remained underground as Templars.
Mm-hmm. So in order to understand why the Pope disbanded the Templar order, we have to understand exactly where the Templar order came from and its mission, because most people would believe that the Templars were established after the First Crusade in the early 12th century, but I think your research points to the fact that they were actually formed before the First Crusade even began. Can you go back to the origin of the Templar Knights
Sure.
and what their purpose really was?
Yeah, according to our records and our archives, the order was actually started as early as 1096, where there were certain families that perpetuated Gnostic Christian thought and who were in association with some of the Kabbalists in Troyes in France and also in Spain, and who were also in contact with some of the Sufi and Druze traditions. There was a mission that was put forward in order to try to get these mystical traditions to all kind of come in contact and work together in order to spread further light throughout Europe and the world, and hopefully to bring more peace. And at the same time, there was a concern that the upcoming crusades that were definitely happening at this time were going to destroy many holy relics and sacred texts and other things that were important to the primordial tradition. And so the order was organized really to go out, reestablish contacts with these other mystical traditions, and to secure some of the documents and artifacts within the Holy Land to ensure they wouldn't be destroyed by crusaders or by the church itself.
In terms of the Crusades, what is your take on the actual motivation for the Crusades? I mean, you know, obviously it's still debated as to when exactly the Crusades were not called, but actually planned, because there were indications of it being planned from like the 1060s, 70s forward, and taking then 20 years to be called. And usually it's put forth that, you know, the Catholics had to go and liberate the Holy Land of Jerusalem from the Muslim rule, and yet, you know, I would wonder if there wasn't other motivations in terms of the, you know, economic motivations or perhaps spiritual motivations behind it besides this. What is your take on the Crusades?
Well, my take is that it was most definitely economic considerations that were being done by primarily by the church at the time. You have to remember that the church was going after all kinds of groups at this time. I mean, other than just Muslims, they were also very anti-Jewish. They went after any form of Christianity that was different from the standard Roman Catholic dogma at the time. And it became very clear that if they could suppress people in the name of God, that they could attain their wealth. You know, they could confiscate their wealth. So it was a great motivator for building up Europe at the time at the expense of others. Mm-hmm. So I think there was definitely economic things that were going on. Our Templar tradition suggests that part of what we were trying to do, while outwardly appearing to be under the guise of Roman Catholicism, we were secretly passing on a Gnostic doctrine coming from the root gnosis, which just means divine knowledge, with the idea that anybody could connect with God and you didn't necessarily need the intervention of a priest in order to do it. And this was a heresy, but it was deemed that you know, the Templar order, while outwardly appearing to be a product of Europe was actually secretly establishing connections with other older traditions that had already existed in the Holy Land.
Mm-hmm.
There was one other thing related to the Crusades we need to understand. There's a very famous quote by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and it was kind of cynical, but he actually said something along the lines of, well, this is good that we have these Crusades going because all of the people that don't want to civilize Europe have now left it.
The savages have gone. And Saint Bernard was the benefactor of the Templar order.
Yeah, he was the benefactor. He wrote the rule of the order. He was the cousin of one of the original, I think it was the cousin or maybe the uncle of one of the original knights that helped form the order. He also helped start the Cistercian order, whose job was to translate texts that the Templars were bringing back from the Holy Land. Mm-hmm. And he had close associations with the famous Kabbalist who was known as Rashi. So
when the Templars, I mean, the story goes the Templars were formed in the early 12th century, and then they basically go to preserve Jerusalem to protect pilgrims who are coming to the Holy Land, right? And there are only 9 of them initially, right? I mean, this is all the mythology around the Templars, right? There are 9 Templars who base out of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they're basically Al-Aqsa was it formerly the site of Solomon's Temple?
Well, it was said to be the former site of Solomon's Temple. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's why it was a sacred. One of the reasons why it was considered a sacred place. You know, it was one of the most holy sites in Islam, as well. And you know, the thing that most historians don't look at, particularly European historians who have a kind of Roman Catholic filter on their eyes whenever they look at the Crusades, is that, you know, the Templars, they were given special permission to occupy these areas by Muslim leaders. It wasn't like they went in and captured them. They were actually given permission by Muslim leaders to occupy these areas. And the only way they could have done this is if they already had established relations with some of these Muslim leaders.
Yeah, well, and you know, more recently, perhaps there's been a lot of talk about the connection with the assassins, for example, or the Sufi, various Sufi orders, yep. and the exchange of knowledge between the Templars and the Sufis. But particularly to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and there was excavation going on, essentially. The Templars were said to have found some treasure, be it documentation or whatnot, that made them very powerful within the Catholic order, that made them ultimately the first bankers, international bankers that we know in the Western world.
Correct.
Right. What was this great discovery, or what do you believe that? I mean, are you allowed to disclose?
Well, I mean, according to our tradition, there was many things that were discovered. I mean, some of which we can discuss, some of which we can't. Some of it was in the form of artifacts. Some of it was in the form of texts. For example, according to our tradition, and also according to some traditional rabbinical traditions, the famous Kabbalistic texts of the Sefer HaBahir and also the Zohar were discovered by Templars in the Holy Land during their digging, and that these were actually brought back to Jewish communities in Spain in order to translate and publish for the first time. And this is why these Zohar, for example, was first published in the exact same town by the exact same printers as the people who published Parzival for the first time, which was, of course, the Grail legends. You know, but there were other connections. There was also knowledge that was being brought back. There was close association between the Templars and the Sufi, and also the Druze, also known as the Tawhid Muwahhidun tradition that's primarily in Lebanon and primarily Lebanon.
Well, you talk about the Gnostic tradition. I mean, just for people to understand, I mean, essentially the Gnostic tradition has various sects to it. I mean, to this nowadays, obviously we hear about the satanic side of Gnosticism, for example, or like the Crowley-esque version
Sure,
of sex
sure.
magic that goes on. But the essential idea of Gnosticism, is that there were many schools that branched out from the original Christian sects, be it, for example, Essenes and whatnot. And they believed in the idea, as you said, of a direct connection to God, that Christ is actually a consciousness that anyone can attain. And they rejected the idea of the world ruler that the Roman Catholic Church became. When
Yes.
basically Rome became the Roman Catholic Church, it became a temporal power in the world, as opposed to the mystery traditions that remained within Judaism, Christianity, Islam, as well as in the Eastern world, being more of a direct relationship to God. But people oftentimes say, well, that's dangerous, because then you end up with the satanic side of things, where people then claim to be God, and then you can ultimately you can kill without sanction. You can basically do what thou wilt, as Aleister Crowley says.
Yeah, that's the fear. A good friend of mine once said, God created man in his image, and then man returned the favor. We have to be very careful how we define God, because that's what gives us interpretation, or that interpretation is what gives us permission to behave in a particular way. If you believe in a vengeful God, for example, well then, geez, that gives you permission to act vengeful, doesn't it?
Right. Exactly.
So, truly though, true Gnosticism, which really has nothing to do with Aleister Crowley, was involved with the idea that Jesus was a great master, or at least a great exemplar, and that his teachings and his life were meant to be something exemplified in order to attain higher states of consciousness, as opposed to what the traditional church has viewed Jesus as, just a savior, right? You do the crime and Jesus does the time. So, the Gnostics were less concerned about having Jesus come and save them. They were more concerned about emulating the message, what they believed was the secret message behind the Gospels, which pointed to this idea that we're all one. First of all, we're all connected to the same universal consciousness that is connected with God, and that by submitting to that higher consciousness, we can reintegrate with it, and in so doing, gain a guidance and a perspective of the bigger order of things that can help guide us in our life and help bring about peace in the world.
Mm-hmm. But now on that subject, as you well know, the mystery schools have dealt with it, going back to the mythology about Solomon's temple being built by jinns.
Yes.
Genies, as we call them in the West, demons, as they're sometimes called in the Catholic or the Christian tradition, and jinns within Islam. But the idea is that they're entities, that we are not alone. They're invisible spirits that are around us. And as every magician realizes, you have to engage with them, or start to recognize them. If you don't see them, at least you can feel them, sense them, do certain rituals or practices to make yourself aware of these things. First of all, do you believe that there is a positive and negative to these forces, and are they external to us, or is this ultimately all mind? Is this all a continuation of our mind, in a sense that we are projecting these things into existence, or do you actually believe that they do exist external to us?
Well, I'll answer it in two ways. One is, yes, I believe there's many things beyond our physical senses. Whether they are physical entities, or whether they are energies, or whether they are egregores or collective consciousness buildups that occur within nature, that can do things and be harnessed and everything else. But on the same token, I also, from a Hermetic standpoint, one of the things that the Templars followed was the Hermetic philosophies, or the philosophies of Hermes, who was known as Idris in Islam. And in these ideas, the idea of the Hermetic philosophy is that everything is within the mind of God. So everything that we think is real out here is actually not. It just appears real to us. And that within this, because it's all within the mind of God, and we have the illusion of a certain level of free will as we navigate within it, that would imply that all of these entities are also within the mind of God. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, is it real or not? What we can say is even angels, for example, most the names of all of the names of the angels, for example, usually tend to end with the suffix of El. So Michael or Gabriel or Uriel. El just means God, and these names represent aspects of God. So Michael, for example, means who is like God, or Raphael means God heals, for example. So are they an actual physical entity, or are they a consciousness construct that represents an aspect of God's consciousness?
Right.
I think it's easy for us to anthropomorphize it because it makes it easier for us to associate it that way.
Mm-hmm. But there's obviously a tradition within the mystery schools, and that has to do with initiation. The reason for people obviously look to the mystery schools and they say, well, they must be evil because they're secretive, right? Be it the Freemasonic, the overall Freemasonic network, which is vast and incorporates things like the Templar Knights within and many other secretive orders. Obviously, there's degrees of initiation that take place within it. Would you say that the secrecy deals with exactly these kind of initiations of dealing with spirits and entities that one must fundamentally address in order to
I think it definitely has to do with perception. I think in the true mystery tradition, it's dangerous to initiate anybody before they are ready. And the reason for that is if you are still driven by your fears, you're still driven by your desires, you're still, if your ego has a total hold over you, exposing you to certain truths or certain other levels of perception can cause some people to attract things. If you're thinking negatively, you're going to attract negative things to yourself. And, so there's and some of the perception as well, if people weren't ready to see a bigger construct of reality, it could drive them mad. Mm-hmm. So the secret is less about, trying to maintain only a small elite with having perception, and more to do with ensuring, there's a certain responsibility that you have to people in making sure that you're not going to put them in a situation they can't handle.
Right. But then here we are on Earth, as you say, sharing a planet that's been beset by war, that for the most part looks like hell. That's, as far as the conditions of most of humanity, as far as the nature of our suffering and our ignorance, the fact that we have been blind, we have been kept ignorant by the mainstream media, by our education system, right? Even the concepts we're discussing are not discussed by the mainstream. So people are being held in ignorance. Yeah. Would you say that, in a sense, I've read certain interpretations of the Illuminati where the Illuminati are both positive and negative, like the spirits we're talking about, these forces. But part of what the Illuminati is doing as far as this time period has been to, in a sense, in order to catalyze change in the alchemical sense, you have to go to the darkest night. You have to basically, go through the cycle of darkness in order to give birth to a new dawn. Do you think that, does it make sense that there's basically been a cycle of materialism, of crass materialism and suffering and terror for humanity as part of the actual awakening and the transformation process that can occur en masse, as though there's a mass initiation going on, whether people realize it or not, so that those who can wake up will start to see in all these events the signs and the symbols to basically guide them to their awakening.
I think there's something to that. I think if we accept the fact that all of this was within the consciousness of God, I mean, ultimately the greatest desire would be for an awakening to self-realization. And sometimes that's not an easy process. And the Gnostics, they divided humanity into 4 classes, and this has pretty much been this way all throughout history. In that they said that the first class was referred to as Hylics, which meant these were the people that were totally obsessed with their physical senses, their material nature, and that's it. And pretty much forever, that's composed about 80% of humanity. That's all they think about is from living from one meal to the next, one titillation to the next, one bowel movement to the next. And they said that the goal of initiation then was to wake people up to the greater potential within people. So the next level was associated with a mastery of the emotions and the emotional life of man and the emotional energies. The level after that was associated with the mind and the creative potential of the mind, and ultimately the mind's connection with the greater mind. And finally, the last level was a level of spiritual illumination and action, being able to act as an agent or a master in the world in helping to bring about positive change. And it seems like humanity has a history of whenever we develop new technologies, along with it comes new abuse, and it takes a while for people to figure out how to use these things responsibly, for the greater good. And of course there's always people wanting to profit off of it. So
right. Would you, I guess, to put it bluntly, do you think that, for the most part, Masons rule the world, or the highest, usually in the higher positions of power, whether it be politically, economically? Is it generally Masons?
Maybe not in the sense that people think. I do believe that an initiate of any tradition, if they truly understand the bigger picture, whether they're calling themselves a Mason or a Rosicrucian or a Templar or whatever, they're able to see further than most people.
Mm-hmm.
And consequently, sometimes they're able to jump on opportunities sooner than others. Sometimes they can see the consequences of things before they manifest. Sometimes they can conceive of things in a way which it ends up manifesting in the world long before anybody suspects it.
Right.
Well, and in this way, I think it does give them a certain advantage.
Sure. You think about Da Vinci's basically designs for things like helicopters and planes and whatnot 500 years before they were invented. But then you also get these stories and lore about the gin deals, for example, the idea that actually technology is given oftentimes or inspired by these entities that we're talking about, and that it's basically coming. It's as though there's a time for it to be introduced into society, and as you're saying, those people who are more inclined, spiritually initiated towards it, will then be able to make the deal. But oftentimes it seems that there's a consequence to the deals. When it comes to making deals, they may give you the day, but then you lose your life in the spiritual life in the long term, for example.
Yeah, there's always a danger in going into anything. I was once told by someone who I considered a great teacher of mine. They said to me, remember, Tim, that you can visualize and manifest anything, but you also get to have what comes with it. And people don't like to think of the consequences of what can come with it.
Mm-hmm.
You brought up Da Vinci, there's a great episode in his life where, and you can read it in his notebooks, where he discovered scuba gear for the first time. And you can see how excited he was, and he realized that this new technology would allow armies to be able to defend themselves in ways that they've never been able to before, and they'd be able to explore things that they'd never been able to before. And you could read how excited he was. And then the next day he writes in his notebook, and of course, this invention must never be revealed to humanity. They are not ready for it. He was able to see the long-term implications of what could happen if people at that stage got a hold of it.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder too, because again, we talk that obviously that requires a great deal of spiritual knowledge and self-awareness, but there's also oftentimes lore about actual walk-ins or jinns in human form. They're actual people who look human but are actually not human, for better or for worse.
Yeah, maybe possessed or whatever.
Or even born to a bloodline.
Maybe there are at least as according to Islamic tradition, the jinn, or these supernatural energies. Some of them seem to want to help humanity, and some of them want to hinder humanity, and so they're kind of a tricky thing to get your head around. There's a very interesting episode that we find within early texts, because not only does the Quran mention the jinn and their help of the building of Solomon's temple, but we also find it in some of the early Kabbalistic texts. There's a text called the Testament of Solomon that, as far as we know, dates back to at least 150 of the current era. And in that text, it also talks about King Solomon. It doesn't refer to him as jinn, it refers to him as demons, but it alludes to King Solomon, capturing these demons in order to build his temple for him. And I think that whether that happened or not, I think it is kind of it can be a beautiful metaphor if seen in the right light, because nobody wants to have to deal with forces of darkness. Nobody wants to have destruction in the world. But if you can harness the corrupting influences of the world and get them to transmute that energy into something positive, like a temple to God, for example, then you are bringing about a spiritual transformation in not only the environment, but in those entities themselves. Mm-hmm. And something that the Templar tradition and certainly other traditions have mentioned is that if there are supernatural entities, it doesn't mean that they are more spiritually evolved than you are. Just because people mistake power for spiritual attainment, and that's not necessarily the case. Ultimately, we believe that everybody and everything, even the darkest demon in the abyss, will eventually lose their malice and attain a reintegration and celebration of God. Mm-hmm. And we have to believe that. I mean, and this thing we call life is just working that out in this imperfect playing field that was probably designed to be that way so that we could learn.
Right. But again, on the issue of the bloodlines, it does seem to be something that pops up quite a bit when it comes to Masonic traditions, Templar traditions. As you even mentioned in the beginning of the Templars, there were families you referenced.
Yes.
And
yes.
you go back, of course, and we think about the history of the Illuminati, so-called the Shiny Ones, and whether or not these were, for example, the offspring of Anunnaki, or those who came from the skies, whether they were in physical form or not. The idea simply being that there are those who are basically chosen to rule, and historically given a certain onus on their bloodline. And is this, is this consistent with the history? Is there an emphasis on bloodlines when, for example, someone is initiated or allowed to rise within ranks of Masons?
No, there have been certain the bloodlines that have perpetuated and protected the tradition within Freemasonry, within Templarism, but it's not always quite what people think. I mean, I'll give you a good example. Many people look to Hugh de Paynes, for example, as, you know, he was the first Grand Master of the Knights Templar. And he was, you know, most people think of Templarism as this, you know, Christian crusade thing, which it really wasn't, not in the sense that people think. But Hugh de Paynes actually came from a Sufi background. His family was Sufi, and in fact, his personal blazon or shield was of 3 Moors' heads, which represented his ancestors that he was calling upon to help him in the work that he was doing, which puts a very different spin on what was going on. I mean, there have been family lineages that have passed down the tradition, but ultimately, and have protected it, but ultimately, a fundamental theme that you find within Freemasonry and also within Templarism is that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what family you came from, it doesn't matter what religious background you are. If you are truly dedicated towards coming together with others in the spirit of building something better, building a temple of peace symbolically for the world, then, you know, and you're willing to work on yourself, then, you know, you're welcome to participate in that journey. Mm-hmm. The thing is that one of the reasons why mystery traditions have always been suppressed and persecuted has been that most institutions in the world thrive off of creating enemies. They thrive off of us against them mentality. And they gain followers that way by saying, oh, we're the chosen ones and you're not, or we're the, you know, we have the true divine truth and you don't. And consequently, this is what leads to all the fighting in the world. And, you know, the mystery tradition has always said that all of these external forms that people fight over are just paths to a much greater truth. And if we seek for that truth, that it'll unite us as humanity as opposed to dividing us.
In terms of the mention of de Payens, I've seen some genealogists trace the Bush family actually to Hugh de Payens. But what makes sense, as you're saying, it would make sense if the Payens family was actually Sufi or more Muslim, because that's basically the region of, you know, that goes back to maybe Babylon or Egypt, right? The ancient civilizations that really, you know, that gave birth to the mystery schools as we know it, the real right. Mystery traditions, predating all these religions we talk about now, which are just, to my thinking, they're just kind of they're window curtain dressing. You know, it's like the Christian ceremonies that's coming up, the Christmas, is window dressing for ancient mystery school teachings about the death of Adonis and Dionysius and Osiris, right?
Yes. Yeah, you know, it's all the same story. I think the story changes slightly depending on the culture it's coming out of, but you know, if we learn to understand the message behind it as opposed to getting hung up in the forms, we realize they're all pointing to the same truths. Mm-hmm. This is what the mystery tradition has always maintained and perpetuated, and this is why it is not. There is nothing contradictory about the idea of a Christian Gnostic Templar hanging out with Sufi and Druze and Kabbalists and whoever else, because even though they're using slightly different language, they're all pointing to the same truth. And when they realize that, they can work together great.
Mm-hmm. And it allows for a very well, it perpetuates the international mindset. But I'm curious, about you. You know, I've read your work, and you oftentimes reference Albert Pike, who was a notorious Mason. Some people said he was the head of the Illuminati, or whatever, whatever the Illuminati means. But he basically was one of the heads. 33rd degree Mason from the South. He'd been part of the Confederacy, organizing the Indians with the Confederacy against the North. Very controversial figure. Some people even allege that he was involved in founding the KKK. But in terms of his morals and dogma, it's obviously it's considered one of the textbook basically for Masonry, and you know, he refers to Lucifer as the real God, right, and Jehovah as the evil God. First of all, do you believe that, you know, do you think that a lot of the things that kind of that would put him in a negative light are misunderstandings of his actual work? And secondly, I want to deal with the question of the Illuminati with later. So first, just, you know, your interpretation of Pike. I mean, was he actually fundamentally a great thinker, and we should ignore his sort of historical connections and connotations?
He was a great thinker. He was a product of his time. He was writing to a culture that had very definite views about things at the time. You know, we have to remember that you know, this is when slavery was still going on. Even Abraham Lincoln was not a favor of abolishing slavery for most of his life. So you know, he was a product of his time. That being said, Albert Pike was responsible for, you know, he was responsible for standing up for Indian rights. That's how he you know, he was an attorney after he was a lawyer for a good portion of his life, where he was actually fighting for Indian rights. And he also, there was an African-American branch of Freemasonry called Prince Hall Freemasonry, and Albert Pike gave all of the Scottish Rite rituals of Freemasonry to the Prince Hall, African-American Prince Hall Freemasonry, so that they could perpetuate them as well. And I don't think he would have done that if he was the evil racist that some might think. But that being said, with the question of Lucifer, Pike was writing to an educated audience who understood Latin and Greek and Hebrew and some of these other languages. And you know, the word Lucifer just means light bearer. That's all it means. And in modern times, people have confused Lucifer with Satan. Mm-hmm. But those two haven't always been the same thing. In fact, it's relatively recently that the church associated Lucifer with Satan. And even Satan, Shaitan just means adversary, and you find episodes, for example, in the New Testament where Jesus calls Peter a Satan. So it didn't necessarily mean what people think it means. Ultimately, Pike believes that, as the Gnostics did, that anyone could attain the light of understanding of God, and that this reintegration with God, or this illumination, or this nirvana, or this enlightenment was something that allowed one to gain their spiritual source back and be able to leave the you know, mundane ridiculousness of the world behind, consequently.
Right.
And Lucifer represented a symbol for that that process. There was even within some mystical traditions, they associated even what we associate with the devil. They associated the devil, whether you want to associate with Lucifer or Satan, as the greatest servant of God, because none of the angels, when God asked the angels to bow down to man, Lucifer said, "No, I won't, because man is below you." Because he loved God so much, he wouldn't bow down. Mm-hmm. And so consequently, he was kicked out of heaven for it, symbolically. But because there was a separation he was placing between God and man, really is what it was. And the belief is that if we didn't have a opposite force to tempt us, we would never learn the lessons we need to learn in order to grow closer to God.
Right.
So technically, if you want to personify him, he'd be doing us a great service in order to help us eventually get closer to God.
Yeah. And again, that goes back to the one interpretation of the Illuminati being, both positive and negative, and the negative actually doing a service towards waking people up through suffering, through creating, through manipulation, through things and that actually at the time may seem painful, tragic, hopeless, but actually are part of that maturation process. But so again, I wanted to ask in terms of the Albert Pike question. There's maybe perhaps apocryphal letter that was written between him and Mazzini, who again was one of the high-level Masons, if not Illuminati members in Italy. And according to this letter, they prophesy 3 world wars, beginning with the war, essentially, I mean, I'm boiling it down, but basically beginning with the war against Germany, turning that into the war against, basically Germany, then ultimately creating, the second war would ultimately create Bolshevism or whatnot. But the point is that it predicts the 2 wars that we've already experienced, and then a 3rd war that would ultimately be in the Middle East between religions, leading ultimately to not anarchy, but just basically to a post-religious order, to what some people said atheism, or something beyond the religious construct that we have now. Have you looked into that letter in terms of the historical authenticity of it, or is this just apocryphal?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhat apocryphal, but I will say that I would not be surprised if they saw that far ahead in things. I mean, there have been, even Sir Isaac Newton, for example, had his own prophecies about where things would be heading here into the future, as did Leonardo da Vinci, for that matter. I think that there is a great fear. Part of it actually ties in with the idea that we're moving into a new zodiacal age. And there's always been huge uprisings during these transitions between ages, and so the idea is there's some transition there that people have to work out before they're able to reconcile things and move us into a new, level of awareness and peace. I think that as far as the atheist thing goes, Pike was he believes strongly in God. He wrote about God a lot, actually. And he wrote about the different cultures' interpretations of God. In particular, that's largely what Morals and Dogma is about. But ultimately, I think he believed that, people have to almost go through a form of atheism, one form or another, before they can come to truly know God. There's a great episode in the story Parsifal by Wolfram von Eschenbach, in which Parsifal's out searching for the Grail, and he comes to the Grail castle, and he doesn't attain the Grail, and then he quests for another 6 years trying to find it again. And during that time, there's allusions to him becoming an atheist. And it wasn't that he didn't believe in God anymore. It was that the God that was being perpetuated by the establishment at the time wasn't the true God that was resonating with him. And each person themselves has to find that inner connection with God. I mean, this is part of the Gnostic process. It's part of the psychological process. We all have to be able to set aside for a minute the things that maybe we've been raised and taught, and find our own personal connection, and be able to, and through that, be able to maybe see these things in new light.
Mm-hmm. Well, great insights, Brother Timothy. I appreciate you coming on. And for those who want to read more of your work, I mean, obviously you've written quite a few books, but you know, Chemical Keys to Masonic Ritual, The 32 Secret Paths of Solomon, Entering the Chain of Union, I think, is that the last book?
That's that's my main new one. I mean, a lot of what we've been talking about today, you can find in much greater detail in Entering the Chain of Union.
Great. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights with us, and hopefully we'll get into another conversation, deeper conversation at a further date. So appreciate you taking the time, though.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Well, there you are, folks. I would definitely urge you to check out Timothy Hogan's work, his books. It goes into even more detail, and he's obviously a very knowledgeable man who's lived a life initiating himself into the mystery traditions and deepening his own awareness and knowledge. So, in this holiday season, I urge you to go to the library, check out some books, expand your mind, expand your thinking. It's the time of year to do so, as it gets dark very early and allows for the night side to prevail. All right, this is Sean Stone signing off.